Our company, Team V Consulting, Lee Johnson, Eric Davis, Howard Vernon, and myself, Clay Allen, has been engaged by Big Oil Inc. to help it establish best management practices related to its deep water division. Big Oil had some legacy assets that turned out to be very prospective for deep water development in the Gulf of Mexico. Because of the age of the company, there are several older managers, along with a new set of younger managers, that are learning how to work with each other and preparing for younger generations to take on more responsibility as others retire. Facing a challenging business environment due to the challenging commodity pricing, Big Oil and its employees must determine whether it has the wherewithal to operate safely, even if that means investing in capital to be able to achieve zero safety incidents that are financially material to the company. The board of directors of Big Oil decided to engage Team V Consulting to study the company and its processes, hoping to learn and identify big picture issues related to the strategic management and vision of the company, and what might be obstacles that the board of directors did not know about that would prevent the organization from executing its vision. The board of directors authorized Team V Consulting that sources of information gathered would be given complete anonymity and that in the event of disclosure, there would be no retribution for being honest and asserting one's view. John Carson is a mid-level manager for Big Oil Inc., a large, non-integrated oil company. Carson's primary responsibility is the oversight of offshore deepwater drilling team that manages an annual budget of around $250 million. Carson reports to John Smith, who is firmly entrenched in the executive management team of Big Oil. Smith is a demanding boss who is known for getting his way by ruling with strict authority and often dances the line. Smith has his eye on eventually becoming promoted to the chief operating officer position of the company and must deliver on several key metrics that include a profit target. Carson is part of various deepwater drilling technical groups and has learned many of the best new management practices that came about as a result of the learnings of the BP Macondo oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Carson has set out a document for internal approval that promotes the adoption of integration of said new practices in Big Oil's procedures for future projects, and more importantly, encourages these new learnings to become part of the company culture. Smith's focus has always been on the bottom line, and he fears that changing course or implementing new practices would lead to a decrease in profit. Smith won't approve the document for wider circulation throughout the organization and continues to nitpick the details. If Smith has his way, the teeth of the new management practices will be gone by the time he is done. Meanwhile, Carson feels that the company is taking risks that could have material impacts on not only the environment where the company operates, but also pose significant risks to company personnel as well as the shareholders. Now here's Lee Johnson. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Clay. As the drilling manager for Big Oil's Gulf of Mexico deepwater rig, Carson is responsible for all the operations that take place on the rig structure. It is so capital intensive to drill these large wells in the deepwater environment that extra strain has been placed on the shoulder of the entire Big Oil team. This strain has manifested itself in the form of conflict as Big Oil struggles to squeeze every dollar out of an already shrinking profit margin. As he was in the past, Smith is excellent at applying pressure on his subordinates to deliver cost-driven results for Big Oil. He uses his coercive power to punish Carson when daily drilling reports do not meet his lofty expectations. Oftentimes, Carson has been instructed to remain on the drilling rig for a month at a time rather than the two-week rotational shift. Smith often calls Carson with a high level of assertiveness and talks down to him in a threatening fashion when goals are not met. Additionally, he uses upward appeal to influence Carson, claiming that the upper management team supports his decision on issues. This puts Carson in a very difficult position, as he is obviously the subordinate to Smith, but he believes he is more correct in many situations. The regulatory and environmental rules have changed, and Smith held Carson's same position some 15 years ago. Carson believes Smith does not fully grasp the modern offshore drilling environment and is unjustly restricting his various project budgets in a fashion that requires him to break certain rules. Smith's hard influence tactics have clearly not worked well with Carson, as the recent disagreements have intensified. Smith is fully prepared to use his organizational hierarchy and past experiences to solve current problems, while Carson believes a modern adaptive approach must be taken to ensure all regulations operations and safety requirements are met. Carson is also at a crossroads of sorts. He is unsure how to proceed in this challenging situation. He has considered going above or around Smith to bring these issues to more senior management than Smith, but he runs a significant risk of having his employment with Big Oil terminated. In these tough times, jobs are scarce, and Carson is keenly aware of this. Please take a look at our recommendations. To begin, we believe Carson should seek Smith out in a face-to-face manner. That way there will be no visual communication lost or verbal misinterpretations. Carson needs to be keenly aware of the situational approach he is using prior to the meeting and stay consistent. We suggest using a supporting leadership approach in this situation. Through our past research, we have found that oftentimes senior management in large firms tend to be more egotistical and lack humility. They can be overly aggressive and sensitive to criticism. Using that supporting approach, Carson would keep a low directive and high supportive tone through the meeting. He doesn't appear to directly challenge Smith, but he wants to appear supportive and understanding in the way that Smith sees the situation. Carson needs to present how to best approach their operations from a safe yet cost-saving standpoint. It would do him no good to suggest tactics to improve operational safety if they were drastically more expensive. As previously stated, Smith is somewhat inept in the modern environmental regulation environment surrounding the deepwater offshore rigs, but he is very aware of the budgetary issues. Carson can indirectly help educate Smith on some of those nuances that have come about since he left the rig and became a full-time office employee. He should explain to Smith that by cutting corners and reducing capex on the front end, they're directly exposing Big Oil to unnecessary risk should a well event occur. If Smith is able to view this issue through that lens, the cost-benefit analysis would likely be enough for them to reach an agreement. Additionally, it is our belief that through the contracting of Team B Consulting by Big Oil, our review adds anonymity and to the organizational evaluation we conducted. That being said, we believe Carson should bypass Smith and engage Big Oil executives to help rectify the situation. He should present to the Big Oil executive team a document highlighting the best management practices the firm should strive to engage in. We feel with this concrete form of direction, Big Oil will be able to quickly and efficiently begin making the necessary changes to rectify the dysfunctional culture the firm has developed. By making these recommendations, we feel that Carson will be able to maintain a position of job security, as any pushback received from Big Oil could be directly focused to this Team V Consulting rather than to Carson. He would be able to remain in good graces with the executive team when navigating this challenging situation. Now I'll turn things over to Eric Davis. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. During Team V's evaluation of Big Oil's operations department, we noticed the overall approach to offshore development being eerily similar to BP's, and had Big Oil opted to continue along a similar trajectory, it could have led to another deepwater catastrophe. Through interviewing a number of Big Oil employees and digging through well files, we discovered some troubling themes. In one scenario, we see a rig contractor caution John Smith, the Vice President of Operations, via email to let them perform inspections and maintenance of the blowout preventer prior to Big Oil drilling the Golden Hurricane No. 4 well. John Smith never replied, so the drilling engineer tasked with drilling of the well made a unilateral decision to move forward with commencement of operations. Another situation that raised a red flag was a failure to perform proper cement testing prior to casing of the Tulsa Gulf No. 2 well. Again here, we see a vendor caution an entry-level drilling engineer who was charged with field oversight to test the cement prior to casing. The drilling engineer chose to ignore the advice and move forward without testing. Per the Big Oil Policies and Procedures Handbook, the drilling engineer did not have the autonomy needed to make that call. Instead, he was supposed to present the issue to the drilling manager and have him sign off on it. However, the drilling manager didn't find out until after the fact. When the drilling manager attempted to write the young employee up, he was told not to because his subordinate was a nephew of the CEO. Those two scenarios are merely symptoms of two major root issues that we identified: the inability to control communication among upper-level management and an inability to control the behavior of Big Oil employees. Another major reoccurring theme Team V Consulting unveiled during the interview process was a significant lapse between the strategy formulation and implementation phases. While interviewing a completions and production manager, he discussed his frustrations with overall operations processes. He stated that a significant amount of management's time was being dedicated to long, elaborate brainstorming sessions about future development, well designs, and facilities construction. He felt that many great ideas and strategies were formulated during those meetings, but that they were never put into action because they were slightly more costly than the status quo, or managers didn't have the necessary tools needed to ensure their subordinates were satisfying their jobs according to the plans. Our recommendation to Big Oil serves to address and correct the primary issues identified. 1. The inability to control communication and behavior, and 2. The failure to move from strategy formulation to strategy implementation. As it sits currently, Big Oil only conducts audits after a well has been drilled and completed, and those audits only have to be reviewed and signed off on by John Smith. The operations mistakes we noted took place prior to and during the drilling portion of each well. We recommend 2 additional audits be conducted, one prior to spudding and one prior to casing being set. Additionally, we suggest having these audits reviewed and approved by the Vice President of Health, Environment, and Safety to strengthen checks and balances within the organization. From there, Team V Consulting recommends establishing an organizational behavior modification mechanism to help enforce proper communication and behavior control, while also ensuring that plans are not only formulated but likewise executed. As a go-by, we suggest Big Oil's HR department acquaints itself with BP's post-Macondo approach to managing potential risk in wells. Big Oil HR should take that model and tailor it to monitor and correct shortcomings that are unique to Big Oil. Once HR has adopted a final model that is ready for implementation, Team V Consulting recommends hiring an in-house organizational development practitioner to provide oversight on rollout of the new audit process within operations and safety departments. As part of the OD practitioner's role, he or she should be tasked with designing workflow communications charts to make sure new processes are streamlined between the operations and safety departments. In addition to new audit process implementation, the OD practitioner should develop a post-audit reinforcement system to reward or recognize Big Oil operations personnel that satisfied all expectations during well design and execution, while simultaneously punishing those employees who failed to satisfy those requirements. Team V Consulting believes that successful scheme and application of the new audit process and reinforcement system will increase communication and behavior control while improving transition from strategy formulation to strategy implementation within the Big Oil ranks. Now over to Howard Vernon for our final remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. I'll now conclude with some closing thoughts about Team 5 Consulting's recommendations for Big Oil. The company finds itself in a situation where it must invest in additional safety measures to prevent a potential multifaceted disaster: financial, environmental, and most importantly, a potential for loss of several lives of both employees and contractors working on the offshore rig. The kicker is that the company doesn't know it faces this situation. So one way or another, Carson must get his message out, and that means bypassing Smith one way or another, somehow, some way. The first choice would be Carson gets Smith to see things his way by using situational and problem-solving methods, and the issue is resolved between the two directly. The second choice would be that Carson confides his findings to Team 5 Consulting, and it gets addressed that way. The very last resort, and certainly most risky, perhaps nuclear option, is to go directly to the executives above Smith and try to hash it out in that manner. To not succeed would be malpractice on Carson's part, at least to not try. The company would preserve property, environment, and life, and it also continues the company's access to deepwater leases by showing the numerous regulatory bodies its commitment to constructing and drilling deepwater wells with the best and latest management practices in mind. A big takeaway for Big Oil should be to see that it must implement the audit processes, study, and likely incorporate some of BP's learnings into Carson's best management practices document, and ensure that never again will one employee be able to keep something from being considered by the rest of the executive management team because it only flows through that one person. It makes a lot of sense to have at least two people view and or approve this type of proposal, along with doing both pre-spud and pre-casing point audits for operations that can easily cost $200 million for one well. Despite the intense focus on the technical side of the business, particularly in an environment like deepwater, the industry must take note of the management, leadership, and process failures that led to the Macondo blowout. To not do so would be at its own great peril. One final note, while we considered adding a financial incentive as a recommendation for Big Oil as a form of negative reinforcement, we decided against it. An example would be if a particular manager that was designated in charge of safety for deepwater operations was the responsible person after the company encountered, say, 2 or more near-miss situations, then their bonus would be reduced by 20%. This seems like a good idea, and perhaps it still can be workable, but like the Macondo blowout, where you had people making bad decisions to save money on the expense side and therefore make more money, more profit, it may have the unintended consequence of simply having people in Big Oil not report near misses, which is an unacceptable outcome. We hope you've enjoyed our case and associated recommendations. Thank you for your time.